As we get closer to the 2024 election in November, it's getting more likely that we'll see a repeat of the 2020 election this year. Nobody is really looking forward to this. Most people disapprove of both the candidates very heavily. They're seen as old, corrupt, unstable. But what's even more interesting than this interesting position we're in as a country is that it's happened a handful of times before. Like in 1900, which was a very interesting year. We just turned the century. We were becoming more industrial, and under William McKinley, we were becoming a world power. McKinley has been called the architect of the American century, the 1900s. Under McKinley's administration, we became more powerful. We went to war against Spain and started to expand into the Caribbean, into Central America, and even Asia, but not without a lot of cruelty. We were more expansionist than ever, and were becoming a nearly imperialist country. For all of the administration's success, many disapproved of McKinley's policies. They formed anti-nationalist leagues. They supported the direct election of senators using a silver standard currency and the populist policies of William Jennings Bryan. Bryan was an extremely talented speaker, a very talented lawyer, and had a very strong following. He was also the Democratic Party's candidate for president in 1896 and now, again, in 1900. He was comfortably defeated by McKinley, who had a 6-point margin of victory. Months after his second inauguration, McKinley was shot and killed by an assassin in Buffalo, New York. Taking his place was Teddy Roosevelt, a more progressive Republican. William Jennings Bryan went on to run for president again a third time, in 1908 when he went up against William Howard Taft, Roosevelt's chosen successor. He lost that too, though he continued to be very influential in the Democratic Party. In 1800, 100 years earlier, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams went up against each other for the second time. The first time, in 1796, the nation was about to do something it had never done before. George Washington had been president for the past 8 years, and had set an amazing example for all future presidents. Whoever came after him would almost certainly not be able to live up to that example, and they would suffer for it. This happens a lot with the men who come after great presidents. Look at Lincoln. He was followed by Andrew Johnson and Ulysses Grant. While Johnson was a terrible president just by himself and Grant was only mediocre, they were serving in the shadow of Lincoln, which made them even less popular. Or with Harry Truman, an all-around great president, great man. He was very unfortunate in that he came after FDR, so it was hard to even compete in the public eye. When Adams was elected president after Washington, he faced the same struggle. He did the best he could, but no matter what he did, he would still be seen as worse than Washington. By 1800, Adams had become so unpopular that he wasn't even seen as a major challenger. The election was really between Jefferson and Aaron Burr, both Democratic Republicans. The two tied in the Electoral College, with the lame duck Adam in third. The election was sent to Congress where, after 36 rounds of voting, they decided that Jefferson was the winner. During this time, Adams and Jefferson, who used to be close friends, grew far apart and even into political enemies. After Jefferson left the presidency, the two started talking again and became close friends, writing hundreds of letters to one another until they both died on the same day, July 4th of 1826, 50 years to the day that the Declaration of Independence was signed. 2 years later, we saw Andrew Jackson run against John Quincy Adams for the second time. When the two faced off for the first time, in 1824, Jackson had won the popular vote by 15 points over Adams, and yet nobody came out on top in the Electoral College. A so-called corrupt bargain came afterwards, with powerful members of Congress managing to push Adams into the presidency against the will of the people. 4 years later, Adams wasn't much more popular than when he started, and Jackson was even more powerful and more popular. He won the 1828 election with 56% of the popular vote, beating Adams without any trouble. He went on to win the 1832 election, and then his vice president, Martin Van Buren, took over in 1836. Van Buren first won against William Henry Harrison with a pretty comfortable 20% margin in the popular vote. However, 4 years later, Harrison was threatening to boot Andrew Jackson's chosen successor from the presidency. He and his running mate, John Tyler, ran one of the first real political campaigns in the history of American politics. They painted Van Buren as an upper-class, out-of-touch New York politician and Harrison as a noble hero of the Native American Wars and a man who had helped settle the state of Indiana, experience that would be helpful as the United States continued to expand and settle their lands. In reality, Van Buren wasn't rich. He was born in rural New York, raised by his very much not wealthy farmer father. He was a very smart man who knew more languages than any other president ever. Harrison, on the other hand, was born wealthy, to a family which did have political influence, and he was a man who had to do very little all of his life to earn any position that he ever had. Regardless, most people didn't see these facts, and they only saw what Harrison made them see, and so they chose Harrison and Tyler over Van Buren in 1840. 3 months into his presidency, Harrison would die, and John Tyler, later the only president to side with the Confederacy, took over. In 1956, we were not in nearly as bad of a position. We were still on that post-war boom, and our country was stable, though we were near the depth of the Cold War, the Red Scare, and the Civil Rights Movement. It seemed granted that the incumbent, Dwight Eisenhower, would win a second term. His first term was really a steal. He was a war hero who brought our nation peace, running against Democrats who had held the White House since FDR was first elected in 1932. The Democratic administration had only become less popular after they were in power for well over 2 decades. The Democratic candidate in 1952 was Adlai Stevenson, and while many praised him for being a diplomat and an all-around all-right guy, his liberal policies just couldn't defeat Eisenhower's huge popularity. That's not to say Eisenhower's election was an absolute secure thing. It wasn't, and he did have reasons to be afraid of his chances. Eisenhower was old, older than any president ever elected before him. He suffered a heart attack while in office, surviving, but not without any damage. For the rest of the campaign, Eisenhower was rarely able to do campaign stops because of his bad health, with the vice president, Richard Nixon, often doing it for him. The nation had lost FDR in 1945, when he was 3 years younger than Eisenhower was now, and with less public health issues. People were aware of this, and knew the stakes, and what might happen if our president died, and how that might be a problem for the national security, especially when we were in the middle of a Cold War with Russia. Yet, this wasn't enough to do away with much of Eisenhower's popularity, and so he comfortably beat Adlai Stevenson for the second time in 1956. I saved 1892 for last because I think it has the most relevance to today. And while we don't know what's going to happen in the next year, who will win, who will lose, or any number of other scenarios which will happen this campaign season, this election is probably the most similar to the one happening right now, though it's also very different. Right now, our former president, who lost the last election, is running again for a second term. If he wins, he will be the second president ever to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, right alongside Grover Cleveland. When Cleveland was first elected in 1884, very few people actually knew him. His political rise was really amazing. The first real major political office he was elected to was as mayor of Buffalo, New York in 1891. He went on to be elected governor of the state, and then president in just 3 years. It's the type of rise that is very rarely seen in American history. Quickly, scandals surrounding his administration and his personal life came out that he had a child with a woman that he had not married, that he abandoned the child and paid off the mother to stay quiet about it, that this whole thing may have been non-consensual in the first place. Cleveland denied this all the way through, but regardless, it definitely stained his reputation. Afterwards, Cleveland got married while in office, something that had never happened before. But to make it more bizarre, he was marrying his own goddaughter, a woman that he had practically raised since the age of 11, and who was now just 21 to Cleveland's 48 years old. Besides this, his policies were controversial, if not just unpopular. He lost 1896 pretty narrowly to Benjamin Harrison, grandson of William Henry Harrison. Actually, Cleveland won the popular vote by a little under 100,000 votes. Harrison had much more experience. He was much less controversial and had a fairly successful presidency. Yet, 4 years later, when they had a rematch, Cleveland beat Harrison. Realistically speaking, It makes no sense why this would have happened in any scenario, except for the financial crisis, which had really handicapped Harrison for a lot of his term. While it wasn't Harrison's fault, there wasn't a lot he or anyone else could do about it. He got the blame, which allowed for Cleveland to win again in spite all of his scandals, how controversial he was, and his divisiveness. Now, here, in 2024, the situation is a lot different. Both of the candidates are very controversial. We are very divided as a nation. Age will and definitely has been a major factor since even before either of these candidates were first elected. Both are extremely unpopular, but neither party is willing to ditch them. Yet, even with most Americans being very reluctant to vote for either, most also don't see a third option. It's a difficult position to be in as a country and as a people, and that's why it's important to remember our history, to understand that we have been in a similar, though still very different position. We've been in bad positions before. A lot of the times, it's been worse. Yet for all the hardship, the struggle, the division, we're still one nation, undivided. We've been through a lot before, and it's important to remember that, because we could stand a lot more. But it's still important to care for, appreciate, and be grateful for our country. That is how we stay strong, united as individuals under the same flag, with the common goal of making our country a better place, to continue to lead the world with a vision of hope, unity, freedom, democracy, and justice. That is more important than who wins this election or the next, because we can survive that. But we cannot afford to abandon these values.